Bueno, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Thanks for being here in the afternoon and for being resilient and not being at the beach and being here. Let's hope that we can get the High Representative to join us later on, but he had a call with Brussels for the next GMNet meeting. For me, it's an honor to introduce our two speakers. As you know, this morning, after a very lively session on the enlargement with the Balkan countries, plus the discussion on China, this afternoon we will be closing with a discussion that I believe really fits in very well, and that is the issue of Europe as a geopolitical player in security and defense. We've talked about the triangle and so on, and today we have two very important speakers. I've already got confused with who Nicole was, but this is Spart, as we say, dear Nicole, of...
Je suis sans doute plus âgée que vous.
Mais no. Voilà, perdón. Volvemos a...
And we go back to Spanish and English. Nicole Niesoto is the Vice President of the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris, politologist, one of the reference persons for those that read about what is happening in Europe or in the world, and Hervé Blejean, that up to a couple of months ago was the Director General of the European Union Military Staff. So we're going to divide the time. I will ask to each of the speakers to take from 10 to 15 minutes. Is that too much?
Okay, 20 minutes.
You have this. I
No,
had 20
minutes
minutes on my paper.
20 minutes, okay? And after that, we'll begin with a debate with you. Madam Niesoto, the question for you is about the new Europe, the first stage of a real and common European defense. Where are we on that? After that, the Admiral Blejean you will illustrate us about the advance of the European Union's role as a geopolitical actor in security and defense policy after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Muchas gracias a los dos ponentes.
I would like to thank both speakers beforehand, and ask the floor is yours.
Very much. Thank you for this invitation. I used to be a French civil servant and a European civil servant. I have created, and I was the first director of the EU Institute for Security Studies when Javier Solana was a high representative. So I've used to work with Javier, and now a little less with Josep Borrell, but I have been involved in European security matters since a long time now, too long a time, by the way. So I'm very glad to be here, and I'm afraid I had exactly, on my paper, exactly the same title as you give to the Admiral, so I'm afraid we are going to maybe to repeat each other. Or anyway, you are not lucky because you have two French people today at the panel, so I'm afraid what we will say will be consistent, but I will try myself to be provocative. I'm not anymore a Soviet servant, so I'm free. And I'm free to share with you not only my ideas, but my doubts. I think we are living in a very uncertain world, a certain EU. I don't know how the EU will be next year for the election. I really don't know what kind of Europe we are going to sell to the voters. And this uncertainty, many body says that it is the only one certitude that we have today, is that we don't know anything about anything. We have no more certitudes. So, having said that, I'm going to raise a few questions and share with you my concern about the EU as a security and defense actor. And as a French, I will do it in three parts. First, Ukraine as a geopolitical wake-up or shock for the EU. Second, the illusion of EU as a geopolitical actor. And third, the condition for the EU to become a geopolitical actor. And all this in 20 minutes, I swear I will respect it. So the first point is a very known one. Everybody says, and it is true, that the Russian aggression against Ukraine was a geopolitical shock for the EU. It's true. And it's a shock not only because we were surprised, of course we were surprised, everybody was surprised, including the Ukrainians. They did not believe in it at all. But it's not only because we are surprised, it's also because the war in Ukraine has suddenly killed all the EU philosophy since 1956. The EU was created and implemented as a EEC at the beginning, but it was created on one principle, which was that economic trade, economic interdependence was, after World War II, the best recipe for peace between the French and the German first, between the Six then, and between the Six and the rest of the world. And the idea of Monet and Schuman was a very, very strong idea, a strong belief. They were convinced that the more you integrate economy and trade and then change and then everything between countries, the less they are going to make war, because you don't make war with yourself. So the idea, the principle, the DNA of the EU is trade is a recipe for peace. And it's the reason why the EU was very much in favor of EU enlargement in the 90s first, and then with the new Eastern countries. It's the reason why today the EU, and we have seen this morning in the discussion, is still very much in favor of future enlargement, because there is still this belief that the more you enlarge, the bigger the market, the more solid is the peace. And this, again, was implemented within the EU with an incredible success during the first 70 years of EU construction. It was a big success, and the EU has become, in 2000, the first economic power, the first commercial power in the world, the second monetary power in the world, the first humanitarian power in the world, the first power for public aid in the world, and so on and so on. So it was an incredible success. Obviously, we have doubts sometimes. For example, during the... Comment vous dites Covid en anglais, vous? COVID. During the COVID, we have the feeling already that maybe it's a problem if we cannot make Doliprane, that is to say the medicine against headache, because the material is made in China, and China has 99% of the first component to do this medicine. Maybe interdependence could also be a risk, not only advantage for wealth and prosperity, but maybe also a risk for our security. But anyway, we continue to believe very strongly that trade interdependence was the best recipe for peace, and that member states and their geopolitical ambition, namely the French, with their idea of power and using Europe as a way for their own national power, and so on and so on. And with this idea that member states and their national willingness of power was prehistoric elements, that they have to be eliminated from the actuality. And suddenly the war. And when the war occurred in February 2022, but suddenly the EU realized that her own philosophy was dead in one night. Everything was obsolete, became obsolete in one night because the Russians showed that they preferred geopolitical and national interest to their economic interest of their country and of their people. So suddenly, this was a shock. The real geopolitical shock is this one. We have realized that the beliefs that we had since the last 7 decades was strong, did not work anymore in the year of 2022, and interdependence is not a matter of prosperity and peace, it is a risk for security and prosperity of all citizens. So having said that, obviously, there are some consequences of that, and the EU immediately took some decision in order to adapt itself to this new geopolitical reality that it has discovered with the war in Ukraine. So let me rapidly, and I'm sure the Amiral will go more into details, but there were many consequences of this geopolitical shock. First, the increase of defense budget everywhere, 3% for everybody, 5% for the Polish, for example. Second, the end of historical political tradition in the neutral country, which are very much revolution. Imagine a country like Sweden, it was neutral since 1813, which is a long history. Suddenly they decide to join NATO, as did Finland. Even in Switzerland, I was in Switzerland in July. I mean, there is a strong debate in Switzerland on the question of whether to join NATO or not. So there is a psychological, historical revolution in this country. Third, the German revolution. In my view, Germany is the country which is the most affected by the war in Ukraine, because Germany has built its identity since World War II on two things, which were trade and pacifism. Now we need war and not a free trade anymore, controlled trade with China and the other. So Germany has a deep revolution to make, and they decide, of course, as you know, to increase their defense budget, 100 billion euro, to sell weapons to Ukraine, which was forbidden to Germany until now. Germany decided to arm Ukraine and to rearm Germany, which is a twofold revolution that the Germans are going on, and which will have tremendous consequences for the future of the EU. Fourth, there is also, as a consequence of the Ukrainian, what I call a strategic false revolution. And I want to say a word about Poland. I don't know if there are Polish people in the room, but I would like very much to have a debate on this. Not only the EU spent more on defense, not only the EU neutrality is almost dead, not only the Germany is going to become one of the most important conventional army in Europe, but some countries in the eastern part of Europe, namely the Poles, pretend to have the new leadership in defense. You have read, I'm sure, many articles saying that the strategic leadership of the EU went from Franco-German access to Poles and Baltic access, and so on and so on. It's true that Poles is doing a lot of things for the Ukrainian war, but, and again, if it is a place where we can debate frankly, I want to say two things. First, of course, the Poles have accepted a lot of Ukrainian refugees, but they did not take the black people who were studying in Kiev. Second, they are helping Ukrainians to install or to strengthen their democratic system, but they are fighting against the democratic system within their own country. And this is a strong contradiction. Poland cannot pretend to be the best help to democratic Ukraine while killing the rule of law in the domestic scene. And as you know, in Poland, since more than 5 years, the democratic rules are betrayed every day by the government. So, it's the reason why I call it a false revolution. For me, at least, Poland has no right at all to become a leader in the EU. Because to become a leader in the EU, it doesn't enough to spend for defense. You need to defend the European values, not only in Ukraine, but also in your own country. So this is my first point. Ukraine has a shock and a series of revolutions. Second point, more quickly. Does that mean that the EU is has become a geopolitical actor? My answer is no. I regret Joseph is not here because he would be surprised, but then in my third part I will reassure him. But no, it's not because you have all this revolution, it's not because you spend more on defense that you become a geopolitical actor. And I mean, it would be too easy if it was enough to spend of defense to become a geopolitical actor. Why it is not yet done? Why, despite of all what I've said in the first part, the budget, the neutrality, joining NATO, why it is not enough? Because there is a second principle, there was a second principle in the EU when we have created in 1956, the Rome Treaty. There was a second principle, which was that NATO and the US are the best and the only one defender of the EU. This was the sharing of tasks between NATO and the EEC in 1955. NATO was doing the security of Europe, and the EEC was doing the prosperity of Europe after World War II. This was a basic sharing of tasks, which is still valid today. And so, according to the second principle, all the Europeans today are increasing their defense effort, their defense budget, but within the NATO framework. They want NATO to protect them. They want the US to protect them. Nobody wants to increase European defense for today. They want NATO to be stronger and stronger because they believe, and they are right in doing so, that only the US military capacity can deter the Russian, if ever the Russian would think to do more than attacking Ukraine. So the paradox of our situation is that we have an EU which is becoming more geopolitic than ever, but the EU does this revolution within NATO, within the NATO framework. And we are living today an Atlantic moment. We are in an Atlantic moment. Only the French believe that European defense is going to be stronger after the Ukraine. It's not true. Nobody believe it. Everybody wants NATO, only NATO, and just NATO to protect them. And they are right to do so, because if you look at European defense, it is not at all organized to protect the EU. So this is my second point. The EU is not yet a geopolitical power, despite all the revolutions that we have done until now. Third point and last one, does that mean that the EU will never be a geopolitical player? Of course not. I think there are three reasons why the EU must continue to build on defense and to be ready to play a more political and military role. The first one is the US election next year. If a strong Republican, anti-European, anti-German, a new president of the United States is elected, as Trump was 5 years before, then obviously maybe they will not want to take care as much as Biden do today of Europe, and maybe the Europeans will be well advised to try by themselves to organize their own security. We don't know, but we have doubt when Trump was elected and when he said that NATO was obsolete, so we don't know what the next president of the US will be. Second reason, if there is a war elsewhere, either in Taiwan or, for example, a war between Iran and Israel, that obviously the US will give the priority to that. So they may ask themselves, the EU, to take more responsibility in Europe for the security and the stability in Europe, because they cannot do both. So there could be a situation where the US themselves ask for more European security and defense in order for the EU to stabilize the European scene while the US will take care of the Middle East or the ASEAN scene. And the third reason is if there is a ceasefire, and we all hope there will be one day a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, then obviously somebody will have to control the respect of the ceasefire on the front line. And here you cannot have a NATO flag. The Russian will never accept that NATO will do the control of the ceasefire. We cannot accept that there is a Chinese flag, because the Chinese have already proposed their mediation, and we cannot accept that it will be a Chinese flag. So the European must be ready to be the one who will control the respect of a probable ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. So there are many situations where the European has to be ready to play a geopolitical role, and it's the reason why, even though now we live in an Atlantic moment, we must not give up. We must not give up the idea of building a strong European defense. But again, I must say in my conclusion, because I'm going to lie, and I will be more than 20 minutes, again, we must not, comment dit-on, se raconter des histoires.
No voy a contarles ninguna historia. No voy a contar ninguna historia.
See, the moment that we live today in Europe is a moment of, comment dit-on, of reinforcement of the Atlantic Alliance. It's not a moment of reinforcement of an EU strategic actor. This is normal. It will pass. So we have to be ready when time is coming to take again the lead for building this EU as a very serious geopolitical player, because we will have a lot of things to do, even especially if the Americans are busy elsewhere. So this is my last word. We are not yet a political player, but we will have to become it, because the world will not be the safer world that the Commission and the trade believer would have promised to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nicole. Merci beaucoup. Veo que, perdón, I am going to speak only 1 minute.
Ma lo entiendo perfectamente.
Como veo que hay mucha gente joven, únicamente.
As I see, there's a lot of young people in the room. I would like to insist on one of the basic elements that I believe is important for the discussion. Europe has never been a geopolitical player because we were protected by the Cold War. We have the umbrella. Now the paradigm has changed completely, but we still don't have the necessary tools, and this is very important for many things. This explains many things. My friends are from the Canary Islands. They cannot hear me correctly, but there is a change in paradigm, and we are not, or the EU is created for peace and prosperity, not to be a geopolitical actor, but to grow financially and to be happy. And now we have to accept our responsibilities in a situation in which we have Palestine, Israel, Arabs, Taiwan. This morning we've clearly understood what is the emergence of the BRICS in the global context. And this is a paradigm that will only be changed by the young people here. Those of us can just say, that are older can just say, we lived happy times in the past.
You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think I will have a slightly different approach or tone than Nicole, but at the end, I think we are joining. So I will start. We didn't consult, but I will start as you did in going in the past. It's important to understand where we are coming from, to understand where we are and where we are going. So as you mentioned, the EU DNA has been built by removing deliberately any military and defense chromosome, because that was another trend to cement peace in Europe. The EU military staff and EU military committee have been created only 22 years ago, so in 2001. And I say only because at this time, as Nicole said also, NATO had almost half a century of existence. And we can understand the friction that and the suspicion from NATO to the EU on this creation as bumping into a well-established security order. The common security and defense policy has even been created later within the Lisbon Treaty, and we had to wait 10 years after the creation of EUMS and EUMC to have an organization taking care of defense and security, the European External Action Service under the authority of the High Representative. But I will dare to say that defense has been seen, is still seen as a kind of sequel branch of foreign affairs, which, except in Ireland, is the case nowhere else in the member states. So when I took my command 3 years ago, where were we? Defense and security started to get some traction with the adoption of a global strategy in 2016, quite a generic, theoretical approach, not really connected to the reality of the changing world. Then the decision of the creation of the MPCC, I explained yesterday, the military planning and conduct capability, was decided in 2017 as soon as the Brexit was decided. Some other initiatives were also developing, showing that the EU was growing and maturing in the terms of security and defense, mainly bottom-up approach. I remind for the records, permanent structured cooperation, PESCO, allowing member states to develop jointly projects relevant to the sector of defense, headline goal process, all those are a very barbaric title, I admit, to develop capabilities matching the CSDP ambitions aligned with the NATO cycle, European Defence Fund to support research and development from the industry in that sector, and the coordinated annual review on defense, which is a kind of sincerity exercise to examine annually how far we are for more ambitions. There were 3 operations, Althea, Atalanta, Irini, and 3 missions in Somalia, Central African Republic, and Mali, training missions. So how are we developing today the language of power in the context of the war of Ukraine, but not only that context? I would like to twist a little bit the question asked. Could the ambition of the EU as becoming a geopolitical actor in defense and security could have developed without the context of the war? And I say yes. It's a matter of speed, not a matter of content. And it's time to talk about the strategic compass. When the war started, the strategic compass was already elaborated, not yet adopted, and we worked all the year of 21 on that. And the strategic compass is setting a very concrete deliverable and ways of a new and realistic ambition for the EU defense and security. It is in fact our first white paper on defense and security in the EU. It defines goals to achieve with quite ambitious and challenging timelines. We have to keep in mind the horizon is 25 mainly, so it's tomorrow. On proposal of the High Representative, so it was developed during that year 21 and adopted in March 22, so 1 month after the war started. But all the work was done before the war started. And even if the war took us by surprise, which is interesting to assess is that is the strategic compass relevant in regard to what happened. For the record as well, some member states had some doubts about the adoption in March and were proposing to postpone it until we get the lessons learned from Ukraine. If we had done that, I think we would still wait for this important document to be adopted. So we were right to push for it. So I will, I think, try to confront the strategic compass with the lessons learned, especially from the conflict against Ukraine, but not only. And to show that for me, it's setting up EU in the right direction. The speed is the challenge. So let me quickly sweep the 4 pillars: act, invest, protect, and partner in that new context. But before I do that, I would like to come back to a prerequisite work that was conducted in order to make sure the strategic compass was adjusting to the reality. We call that the threat analysis. It has been an honest synthesis of all the contributions provided by military and civilian intelligence services, classified at secret level, so you have not read it, for most of you, and with no prioritization on the threat. It's a catalog of all threats and challenging coming from states, organizations, terrorists, competitions, natural evolutions like climate change, and so on. The first lesson I draw in that process, in the context of the war in Ukraine, but not only, is that we are able to have the proper intelligence in the EU, thanks to the provision of intelligence by the member states, and also with a very valuable support from the EU satellite center established here in Spain, in Torrejon. But from the fact to then having the crystal ball to understand what's going on, I think there are some progress to be made, and my first personal lesson is that we have always to plan for the worst case scenario based on the facts we have. That was true for Ukraine, for Afghanistan, for Sudan, and others. I'm not sure we had any signal for Niger. Because it's always better to be ready for the worst, always easier to do less than to do more. If I'm looking at the ACT pillar on the strategic compass, I will not describe it, but there is a lighthouse project in it called the Rapid Deployment Capacity. You have heard about it. It's a concept to be able to deploy 5,000 soldiers in different scenarios, including in a non-permissive environment. And it's a change of mindset that is also very much matching with the wake-up call from Ukraine. It is not a force belonging only to EU, waiting to be employed and depleting NATO forces from this amount of soldiers. It's an organization to be able to act quickly by identifying force generation process, logistic enablers, operational models, and so on. And this rapid deployment capacity concept is also going along with advanced planning in order to speed up decision-making process. So we will constitute, they will, I'm not anymore there, they will constitute a kind of library of different scenarios possible in a lot of countries, being peace enforcement, being evacuation operation, and so on. Some of these scenarios will take dust forever, and some of them will be used and will help to speed up the decision-making process. The second thing is that we also looked through the ACT process to make more robust, agile, flexible, or military missions, which were kind of trapped in an obsolete framework of the EU traditional training mission. We have learned from our weakness. We didn't have at the time the European Peace Facility to allow to combine, train, and equip. Others did equip them. And that has been a weakness in Central African Republic and Mali. But for instance, the newly established EU training mission in Mozambique has been based on this concept of train and equip at the same time. We have also convinced the member states to be able to get rid of this kind of forced debate between executive, non-executive, and to be, if the member states decide so, to be able to accompany trained soldiers on the field, on the operation, not to fight along them, but to be as close as possible from them to make sure, to advise them on the planning and conduct, to look at the way they were doing things. It's always good for the good behavior to have eyes over your shoulder, and also to make sure that the training we were providing is adapted. On the invest pillar, I think that's the one that will be the most impacted by the war against Ukraine. The first lesson will be to understand what is relevant in a modern high-intensity conflict to shape our investment, to shape our future armed forces in the context of the budget raising that Nicole has described. I'll give you one example. In Ukraine, the sky is transparent. What does that mean? It means everything which is flying over 100 feet is detected, is seen, is shot at, and most of the time shot down. The consequence is that you see very few piloted aircraft flying in both sides. It's the kingdom of missiles and drones. So what does that mean for the future air component of our armed forces? I do not have the answer, but that's certainly something we'll have to shape in this context of the invest. Second, we need to ramp up the defense industry. The time of the peace dividend is over. We discussed it yesterday, and I will not develop further. And thirdly, we have to organize the member states to do good business with the defense industry. And I think here that joint procurement is a key element. You know, I've been puzzled when I took my command to see that the budget were started to increase under the pressure of NATO, sometimes brutally requested by Trump administration on the burden sharing. But at the same time, the budget was increasing, but the joint procurement was downsizing from 25% 15 years ago to 11% 2 years ago. So we need really to catch that back. On the protect pillar, it's about resilience, in fact, of our country. The conflict in Ukraine, but not only this one, has revealed more than ever that a war is raging even in peacetime. We call that the hybrid warfare. I'm not sure I like very much the title hybrid, but I would like to go back to a definition that has been given by a former NATO leader. Hybrid warfare, it's everything which is below the threshold of war and above the threshold of action. Cyber is the obvious one, and I will not comment on that. You know all what's going on, and I can tell you that cyber warfare is absolutely a daily context in the war in Ukraine. But not only cyber, but also outer space, the global, what we call the global commands outer space sea challenge. what we call the lawfare, the contest of international laws. It is more and more evident, and there is less and less inhibition from some states to challenge international law. We see what Turkey is doing in Mediterranean, we see what China is doing in South China Sea, and also we see how difficult it is to renew or to get some new UN resolutions. And I think one of the lessons from there is that if we want to speak the language of power, we need to accept that sometimes we will have to act without having the low comfort of a UN resolution. Weaponization of migration. There has been the case between Belarus, Lithuania, and Poland. I will not come back on that. Weaponization of kids, for instance. You see what's going on in Ukraine, deportation of kids, but also yesterday Mr. Putin announced that all the kids at school above 15 years old will be trained on military drones, of operating military drones, including some with weapons. And it's not a game. That's quite disturbing. The undersea possibility of hybrid action, the cables, we know that Russia has the ability to act on bottom sea cables. And as a reminder, 90% of the internet flow between American continent and Europe is going through those cables. We've seen the Nord Stream sabotage, and everything is about attribution. What we know is a sabotage. It has been made by professionals, and they have left no track in order to have no attribution. I think we'll never know who has done it. And then last pillar, partners, and I will go only on two things there. EU-NATO, it has been mentioned. The lesson, I think that the first lesson learned from the war, the absolute complementarity between NATO and EU. NATO has brilliantly secured the collective defense, which is its DNA, by reinforcing organization at the borders. And the EU, as a political entity, acted outside the borders. So I think it's time to definitely kill the wrong debate about a potential competition between EU and NATO, which cannot exist by nature, because member states and allies do and always will have the final word. We own nothing, they do. In EU today, 22 and tomorrow 23 member states are also NATO member, and they are not schizophrenic to that point. And also the CSDP simply prevent to conduct operations and missions for the benefit of the member states within the territory. So the main evidence of that, it has been commented yesterday, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, but also something which is not mentioned enough, Denmark deciding to get rid of the opt-out CSDP option, which was driven by the doubt about this competition. Second, on EU-NATO, we'll have also at some point to address the Turkish-Greece-Cyprus dispute, because even with the most beautiful wish of the world by our head of states, there are a lot of obstacles when practical things are to be implemented. The second thing on partner, Africa. The context of the war in Ukraine has revealed that Africa is not anymore unconditionally buying our model. The votes in the UN resolutions, in the 4 important UN resolutions to condemn the war against Ukraine, has been quite disappointing if we look at Africa. A lot of abstention. When China abstained there, it's a victory. When Mozambique and Senegal, very much supported by EU, abstain, it's certainly not one. So they are sending us a signal. We have to listen to it and to adopt a new way to work with them. They want to be treated as equal partners. And by the way, the last established military mission in Niger, I'm not sure it will develop with the new context, is called EU Military Partnership Mission. It tells a lot about that new way to work with them, getting rid out of any paternalistic approach and to work as partner. And also, we have to be very careful because they are all telling us you are applying double standards. It took 36 hours to provide military assistance to Ukraine. We are still waiting the one you have promised to us 2 years ago. And so this is also something we have to work on. And as a conclusion, 4 considerations among million others as a global power, geopolitical power in being. We are on track. We are working until now. We have to learn to run. And those 4 considerations is that we have to prepare ourselves for possible scenarios of what will be a post-conflict Russia. There are different scenarios. Still a strong Russia, a weak Russia but united, a dismantled, fragmented Russia, fragmented within as many as ethnies. There are different in this territory. We don't know what will be going on, but we have to be ready for that. In that context also, it has been commented this morning, and I will not come back, but we have to deepen our strategy regarding China. I mean, it's not enough to label China as a systemic rival and economic partner. I mean, we have to operationalize our strategy with them through also the Indo-Pacific strategy. I will quote one of my favorite quotes from the High Representative: if Russia is a hurricane, China is the climate change. And we have to get ready for that. And by the way, worst case scenario, coming back to the beginning, invasion of Taiwan by China, what we're going to do. Third consideration, enlargement. It has been commented this morning, and I will certainly not make any political comment. It's above my pay grade. But I would like to raise one question. Potentially, with 6 new member states from Western Balkan, plus Ukraine, plus Georgia, one day, and plus Moldova, potentially EU may reach a number of 36 member states. How do we tackle the issue of decision-making process in that context? It's already, I was keen to say painful, I would say challenging, to deal with 27 different DNAs. And even if I acknowledge that the consensus is the best way to express a powerful voice on the international scene, the consensus is also the best way, most of the case, to lower down the ambition. Will we be able to do it at 36? I really have some personal doubts. So I think there are some taboo questions that we have to raise, like qualified majority in some cases. And last consideration for the future, I think it's time to build a new defense and security partnership with United Kingdom. Know that the scars of the Brexit should start to heal. I think it's a nonsense to discuss about European security without discussing it with UK. It will be difficult. There has been no appetite during the Brexit negotiation on both sides to do so, but we cannot afford to avoid that difficult question. So as a last word, I would like to come back to what Mr. Kuleba said yesterday. I think there are a lot of challenges, but let's transform the challenges in ambition. That's the price to pay to become a relevant geopolitical actor in the future. Thank you.
Aprovechando que el alto representante ha
As the High Representative has just come into the room, we've moved from a macro level to a micro level. It's almost become an economic debate. I think there are lots of questions out there for the debate. But I've been asked by Nicole if she can say a few words.
The first one, Amiral, it's wonderful what you have presented. I mean, you did a wonderful job, and nobody is doubting that the EU has increased its document, its process, its means to become a serious defense player. But as I said in my presentation, it's not enough to do defense in order to become a strategic player. It's not enough. For example, the Commission, 2 months ago, did not find any problem in appointing a US citizen or even an Australian citizen as a DG for trade. This, in my view, shows that the EU has not the beginning of the strategic thinking. You cannot be a serious geopolitical player if you don't see a problem in appointing an American or an Australian as trade DG. I mean, it's just crazy. First example. Second, you cannot be a geopolitical player even if you do all the compact and all the things you have done. You cannot be a serious geopolitical player if you allow China to buy one terminal in each of the big harbors in Europe. And the Chinese, for the time being, possess terminal, comment dit-on des terminaux? Oui, terminals in 7 of the most important harbors in Europe, including Rotterdam, Anvers, Valence, I don't remember. Greece, of course, they have bought carrément, they have bought the Paris. So you are not a strategic player if you allow a foreign country to do that. So it was my first point in my presentation. To do things in defense is okay, but it's not enough. You must have a strategic thinking, not only a defense thinking, but a complete global strategic thinking. My second comment, if you allow me, it's defense against what? Because I mean, at least you may ask the question, we are ready to do much more in defense, but for what? And here, at least in my country, the mode is to speak about, la mode, the fashion, is to speak about to be ready to fight a high-intensity conflict in Europe. And everybody says that, and our Ministry of Defense says that, and everybody, Chef d'État-Major. For me, it's absurd. It doesn't mean anything for 2 reasons. First, Russia is not even able to take Donbass. Can you imagine Russia to take Poland? I mean, it's absurd. Second, we are living in a nuclear world. Poland and all the rest of European countries are supposed to be protected by US nuclear extended deterrence. So the Russians will never attack unless the US say, okay, you can go, we will not use the nuclear doctrine. But for me, there is now a kind of fashion to say we are going to fight high-intensity conflicts where I don't see any scenario. I mean, the Russians are not going to attack. Again, they are not able to take Donbass. Turkey is not going to attack us. Iran is very far. I mean, I don't see the point. And last comment, if I may, defense not only against what, but to do what? To install what? To improve what? We must have an idea of the kind of global order we want. And for the time being, we just follow without any enthusiasm but we follow the idea of the American that the future world will be a big fight between democracy and autocracy. And this is a new novel that the Americans are trying to sell us, the fight, the philosophical, existential fight between democracy and autocracy, which doesn't mean anything. Anything if you look at the real world. We need China on climate change, we need Russia on many things, just because Russia is not the Burkina Faso, it's where it is. So again, we think the EU ought to do a big effort. And I'm sorry you will not be here after the next election, Joseph, because they will need somebody like you in order to have an idea of the kind of world we are fighting for. Not only the kind of enemy we are fighting against, but the kind of good we want to fight for. And we don't have any idea of that. Sorry.
No, please.
That's all.
¿Quieres intervenir?
Would you like to say something?
Bueno, muchas gracias a los dos.
I would like to thank you both then. I think there are many questions for the discussions. I see several raised hands, so let's start with Javier Niño over there, then Marcelino Cabrera, and the gentleman behind that, I don't know his name. Good afternoon, I'm Javier Niño, Director for the Americas of the Foreign Affairs Service. I'm going back to what Nicole was saying regarding Ukraine's invasion being a geopolitical surprise, seeing how a country thought more about its nationalist position than the financial situation. We had seen this in 2014 with Georgia before, and not in a military level, but with Trump at a political level that clearly thought that the interests of the country were more important than the economic interests. We were very aware of the world in which we were living. So, Nicole, as you were saying, we need to rethink what our position is. And a couple of quick questions. Today, the High Representative talked about the Latin America and Caribbean summit. It is true we need to realize we need a different way of communicating with what is called the Global South. We talked about BRICS. This is a challenge, a tangible challenge that up till now we haven't been able to respond to. For whatever reason, the message doesn't really transcend internationally. Geopolitical player should have its own weight, but also being able to create alliances and networks. So the way in which we communicate and our message has to be more appealing for this global south. So we have to reflect on this, because I think we are further away from that now. And then another more controversial question, and that is the geopolitical weight of the EU is the EU with its institutions and the role of the High Representative, but also the impact of the 27 member states. This is a process of communication between all of them. Does Europe need a transfer of geopolitical power of the member states to the EU, which would be a very complex process? And the majority think that this is a good idea, or do you believe we can grow without this transfer of geopolitical power from the states to the EU institutions?
Marcelino, por favor.
Marcelino, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Fonseca. Marcelino Cabrera, former researcher of the European Commission, and I'm recently retired.
For you, Ms. Gniesotto. Merci tout d'abord pour le discours que je trouvais très clair et utile. My question is because you have mentioned, a bit quickly, however I find it very, very important, the need to defend our values. I think many things revolve around it. The issue is how to foster the values, how to export our values. What do you think? Is it about increasing the European identity? Is it about education? What do you mean, and how would you, pragmatically speaking, foster those common values?
Aquí tiene usted. Sí, esta señorita.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Soy Pamela Varela, directora de Cooperamundo, y mi
Hello, I'm Pamela Varela, director of Cooperamundo. I want to ask about the role of young people in this paradigm shift, and now that Europe has the potential of becoming a geopolitical player. Is Europe going to be able to become stronger and show the unity of the states? Now with the Ukrainian war, we see that there are states that are maintaining themselves more neutral. So do you believe that there will be a full consensus of Europe, and do you believe there's going to be a common army, or if this military capacity is going to improve in a joint manner, or how do you think this is going to evolve? Thank you.
Una cuarta intervención aquí.
One fourth question over here. Hello, I have two questions. One is a question linked to values, and another question has to do with Russia. I don't know what are the values of the EU, but they don't agree with me regarding Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya. These are values that do not represent me at all. And regarding Russia,
Yo no sé qué piensan si van a...
I don't know if you believe you're going to end with the aggression. I believe it's never ending. Putin clearly understands that the worst situation for Europe in the last years was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He's done nothing different to what he did in Syria, Chechnya, and Ukraine. And nothing different to the invasion of Georgia and Europe.
Una ronda, pero yo creo que podemos ya con estas cuatro cuestiones agruparlas y
So let's take the four questions and provide some answers to these questions.
On global south, or even though we all agree that it is not, I prefer to call the south why the global south. There is nothing global between these countries, I mean, except the fact that there are 7 billion of people. We are the West, we are only 1 billion. So this is already a big imbalance, and we ought to be more modest in our willingness to lead the world. We are only 1 billion, there are 7 billion. I think the best way to have them with us, it's not to preach them. They are fed up with our preaching about religion in the 19th century. Now we are preaching them with democracy in the 21st century. They are fed up with that because they know we are not consistent with that. We have done a lot of atrocities ourselves in the world. So instead of preaching democracy, let's ask us to respect international law. And they can accept it. They are afraid of their own boundaries. They want their neighbor to respect their boundaries. So if we were speaking to them about Ukraine, saying, stay with us, defending the international law that a country cannot be attacked by another country which wants to change the boundary, we may have them with us instead of asking, I don't know what ideological or moral attitude from this country. And by the way, I don't know, when I was young, the word that we used was an order based on international law. This was normal, the UN Charter and the international law. Now, somebody has invented the expression, a rule-based word, rule-based organization. But what kind of rule? Who has invented this rule? Why don't we say anymore international law? The rule-based organization, but it can be any kind of rule. I'm not going to defend a rule-based world if it is any kind of rule. I'm just surprised. I think the Americans invented this organization, this expression, rule-based world. No, it's a world based on international law. This is my first point. And so don't preach them. Let's ask them to respect international law. And don't ask them to do an alliance. An alliance against whom? And for what? We don't even know ourselves. What do we want? So how can we ask them to join us for what? I think the most simple will be international law, and the most, in my view, the most important thing to do with the South is to let them alone. En français, je dis, laissons-les tranquilles. I mean, the more we ask them, the more they will say no. So laissons-les tranquilles, unless we defend international law, which I'm not sure we are always doing. The Americans did not defend international law in 2003 when they invaded Iraq. It was against international law, I'm afraid to say, but this is exactly that. Second, on EU governance, qualified majority voting, I think it was your question, how to deliver, to give the power from state to the EU. I don't know who asked the question, but, pardon. No, I'm totally against qualified majority voting when it comes to foreign and security policy for two reasons. The first one, all member states are not equal in security and defense. Some member states can do things and do things elsewhere and take risk of death. Other member states, either because they don't want or because they cannot, don't take risks. So we are not equal on this level. And second, if we had to invent a qualified majority voting to deal with foreign and security policy, it has to be on other rules than the actual qualified majority voting. We cannot decide something which imply maybe a death with the rules that you use to sell shoes or buy carrots. It's impossible. So it cannot be the same rule. If we are obliged to go to qualified majority voting, we must invent something else. That's the actual rule, 65 and 45, 55 and 65. This is my position, but I am very much against, because I don't think the Commission has a legitimacy. I don't think member states are equal. I mean, it's just a result of history. It's not a matter of being more important than others. It's just a matter of history. And I think the country who has a military might must not be, cannot be either veto or prevented to do things they believe they have to do when it comes to their own security. And last point on defend value. How to defend our value and how to extend our value. To extend our value, no, I'm not in a preaching mood. I mean, already it will be nice if we can defend our value at home, which we don't do. And the Commission and the European Parliament take more than 10 years before thinking they ought to do something against Hungary and Poland. And we at the Institute of Law with Pascal Lamy, we have been preaching alone. I remember I was alone with Pascal 5 years ago saying we must do something against Poland. We must keep the money they got every year from the, comment dit-on, les fonds structural funds. They have 4% of the GNP every year from the EU budget, 4%. And we said we must keep them. We must keep this money, put the money in a bank somewhere. Of course, the law obliges us to give them the money. But we freeze it for the moment, and we will give them everything when they come back to a rule of law. And everybody, including in the Commission, was saying, no, it's not possible, ta-ta-ti-ta-ta. Now everybody thinks it's normal to have some condition, including financial condition. But we are very late. It's very late, so they feel comforted in their opposition. So in my view, the best way, and you have realized how much I am against the deviation of democracy in Poland and Hungary. I think it's the most important fight that the EU must do, not fighting against the foreign threat, but fighting against the domestic threat, which is the most important thing, which is going to weaken the EU. In my country, if Madame Le Pen wins the election in 27, forget about France. We will leave the EU and it will be a new world. So again, I don't care about expanding democracy elsewhere. I care about defending democracy at home, first beginning by Poland and Hungary. And I think the Commission and the Parliament are not tough enough, or enough tough, I don't know, against this country, because what is going here, it's very, very important. And for example, I think they have the possibility to be in the chairman of the EU in 2024. There will be Hungary and Poland in 1 year as the chair of the EU. Are we going to accept that the EU in 1 year be shared by a country who does not respect the rule of law? Are we going to accept this? And when I say that, people of the Commission say, but we have decided 5 years ago the order of the presidency, so we cannot change. If we cannot change that, I mean, forget about being a geopolitical player. I'm sorry to be so frank. That's all.
So I will add a few things. I will come back on my provocative thought about the qualified majority, where I think we need to have something to trigger the discussion about the decision-making process, because it's unacceptable also to have only one member state when you are about to launch an operation or mission, which will not participate to it, but ready to veto it for some blackmailing reasons or for some principal reasons. And that risk will be multiplied. During the work on the strategic compass, we had heavy discussion on the use of Article 44. Article 44 allows some member states to act with the agreement of all the others on behalf of the EU in an operation and mission. It has never been used. I think that's also a way to explore. It has been in a shy mode written down in the strategic compass, but we have seen how difficult was the discussion. But by any case, it's of course the intent is not to breach any sovereignty there. That's the strength of the EU, is that it's the addition of the sovereignty that make the strength. So yeah, we cannot, certainly not have centralized body in Brussels to take over sovereignty from the member states. On the common army, it's already existing. It's the addition of the armies, of the armed forces of the member states. We will never have a detached, dedicated EU army only working for the EU institution. I mean, it's joining back the former question. So no, the question is how we decide prioritization. That's the member states to answer that question. What we apply is called the single set of forces. I mean, member states have the same forces for their national purpose, for NATO, for EU. It's not like, they are dividing a percentage of my armed forces will be dedicated for NATO, another percentage for EU, another percentage for national purpose. It's all about the same, and we should not be naive when they declare a force ready for NATO in year 27. They will declare exactly the same for EU if they have to commit to the roster of the rapid deployment capacity and so on. And if some national priority occurs anyway, it will not be available neither for NATO nor for EU. It will be dedicated to national priority. So it's just a matter of prioritization and decision by the member states. They are in command. We own nothing, neither in EU or NATO. And the end of the war, I'll take my crystal ball again, we had a good discussion yesterday at the dinner with an historian specialized in Russia, told us where Putin cannot afford to lose that war. So, and in the other way, at this time, President Zelensky cannot afford to stop, to freeze the conflict. So that means we have to be ready for a long-term conflict. And in the worst-case scenario, it will be a kind of permanent, more or less active conflict that could last for years. That's I do not want to be pessimistic, but that's the reality of it. Unless there are some events that trigger another way to look at it, or unless some of the one of the belligerent is getting rid of what he needs to ensure the continuity of the conflict. But the Ukrainian authorities have been very clear when they launched the counteroffensive. They told us, do not imagine that will be the end of the war. We will need another one, we'll need another one, and we'll need another one again after that. So, yeah, I cannot give you a date, but we have to think in a scale of years, I think.
Okay. Muchas gracias. Vamos a empezar una segunda.
Thank you so much. We're going to start with a second round of questions. As a moderator, I don't know if I can say anything about the rule of law, but I would love to. And if we have time later on, I will go back to the issue of rule of law. Second round of questions. Thank you to both of you for your presentations. It has been very interesting that in one same panel there are two viewpoints on one same issue with some similarities but two different viewpoints. It's like I'm like the son that doesn't know if he loves more his mom or his dad right now. But in any case, my question is for Mr. Blejean regarding this strategic compass. What are those issues that have had better results, in which there have been more progress, and which are those where there are more hurdles and obstacles? And the strategic compass was passed before the Ukrainian war. How has it affected the compass? Thank you.
No, no se te oye.
Gracias.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Sergio Pardo, a history student. My question is also for Mr. Blejean regarding the... I'm really sorry, but there's a problem with the mic, and we didn't get the whole question in the interpreter's booth. I'm sorry for that. Could you ask him to repeat? Thank you.
Puedes empezar.
We did understand, but we didn't get the sound. Sorry. You have been speaking about the integration of a European army, and I would like to speak about the French-German brigade, and if you believe, Mr. Blejean, that new experiments like this one could be created, for example, an Italian-Spanish brigade, or even a joint brigade of different European countries, and finally end up creating a European army. Do you believe that's possible? Is something we should wish for or not, or something that would never happen again? Thank you.
Preguntas, por favor.
Any more questions? Yes, there's a question there. Hello. I also have a question for Hervé Blejean. Taking into account that you are part of the military staff of the EU The fact that most member states are part of NATO, does that limit your decision capacity and that of your colleagues in this leadership position? And some European citizens consider that it's necessary for Europe to lead its strategic future and not just follow its protector, the US. Even more, taking into account the economic war with China. And probably in the next few decades, this will end up being a conflict, a high-intensity conflict between China and the US. At least some see it like this, which could somehow affect Europe. So I would like to know your view on this. Thank you.
Por favor.
Thank you. So on the strategic compass obstacles, well, there are some. I mean, it's relatively realistic, ambitious documentation. It has been adopted by head of states. Everyone is happy with it. But when it comes to practically implement things where we can face some obstacles, I will give you two examples. In the strategic compass, the military planning and conduct capacity that we should call the EU military headquarters has been designed as the preferred operational headquarters for any operation, especially to implement the rapid deployment capacity. That means we have to grow, and that means we have to have the adapted capabilities. Regarding growing, today, the military planning and conduct capacity is strong of 60 people. And we aim to go to, in first step, 115, and then maybe 200. The manning issue will be a challenge. And member states are already telling us, well, you know, we have to man NATO, we have to man our national staffs and so on, so that will be difficult. So we are talking of very few people. In fact, we see that if every member states commit 2 people, will not be far from the initial target. So that would be a challenge. And the most important challenge, even if the member states are willing to provide, there is no budget for that. The budget of the EES is delivered by the Commission. The inflation has reduced the room of maneuvering of budget. There is no budget to recruit one single person in addition, either military or civilian. So that's simple as that. We have to go back to the head of state saying, well, sorry, but we don't have the money to recruit, so we will delay the manning. And that's the same thing for the communication and information system. The treaty forbids to use the EU budget for military purpose. And the Ayatollah lowers of the Commission, they are very defending that, and they are explaining us, well, no, we cannot put money to buy CIS equipment, to enable to have a secret level equipment to run operations and missions. You have to find other ways. But we can buy it for civilian missions or for EU delegation abroad. And it would be very good to have the same system to be very interoperable. So this is the kind of obstacle we have really to overcome. We'll find mitigation and solutions, but it's always some kind of bricolage, and it's not satisfactory. On the integration of European armies, so first, I don't believe there will be ever, during my life, still an European army as such. That means an army detached from the member states, working under some kind of command in Brussels. But all those initiatives There are a lot of them. The German-French brigade, but there is also the EUROPA, for instance, are working pending the decision of the member states involved in it. There is no obstacle for them to work for the EU. For instance, the EuroCorps, established in Strasbourg, which is a multinational corps, has been providing force commanders and staff for EU training missions in Mali, in Central African Republic, and so on. So it's just a matter, because they are also working for NATO, it's just a matter of finding the right time frame. And there are also some other initiatives like the EuroMARFOR. So all those have kind of EU or Euro in their title, but they are absolutely not attached to us. It's the way they have labeled it, but they are willing to be part of the story. But European Army, I don't believe it. As I said, it exists already, that the addition of the member states' armed forces. And last question, but leadership position, it's a kind of competition. We have to have the right figures in mind to compare. The EU military staff, 200 people. The military planning and conduct capability, 60. It has been reinforced for running the EU military assistance mission to Ukraine. The NATO command structure, 12,000. So yes, can we compete with that strength? No, and it's not our intention. Is that a competition to assign leadership within one or the other of the organization? I don't have really observed it. Most of the member states consider that their military leaders need to tick some, I would say, multinational box by having some responsibilities within NATO or within the EU. Of course, NATO is offering a much broader scope of position. So I don't see any competition of that. I think that the essence of the obstacles is not there. It's really our own internal obstacles to be able to deliver concretely on what has been decided at the highest level.
No sé si hay alguna pregunta más. Hay dos preguntas.
I don't know if there are any further questions that people want to ask. Yes, there are two, three, it would seem. Off you go. I don't know why I ask.
Stiebergen, a professor of political science at in UBC in Canada and in Sciences Po. Building on what Nicole said, just wanted to put an hypothetical on the table. Say 2026, there are many powerful realist thinkers in the US, in Washington, in Harvard, etc. And of course, there was President Trump himself who have said, in the near term, Europe is rich enough to defend itself. They are very advanced papers, actually, by realist thinkers. And the US should pull all its forces to combat China. So if that were to happen under another president like the one we had before, what would happen in Europe? If that was presented to you, well, sorry guys, you're rich enough, GDP, you ought to be able to defend yourself. So we're pulling out. Very influential people, John Mersheimer, Stephen Walt, and many others have said that.
Sí, tiene este señor la palabra. Sí, por favor.
What about European values and in Afghanistan and Syria and Libya? What about the European values that should have been fair there? And Putin's never going to end this war because he's got two options. He wants to be Catherine the Great, and the only possibility of getting this war to end is for him to end up like Rasputin. There's no other solution. This is never going to end. Final question, and then we'll hand the floor back to the High Representative. I've got a doubt, and it's about NATO. It's been mentioned on so many occasions, and that if there's a geopolitical shift after the states' elections, and would there be a greater tension then between the US and its allies? What would that lead to? Because maybe we would have to be more independent of the US. Have you thought of anything what happened if Trump actually had gone through with what he said when he said that that NATO was obsolete? Or what about what Nicole said, if Le Pen wins in France? That was thought to be unthinkable, but it may well happen. But it may well happen because of the rise of the ultra-right. What would happen if France left the EU, for example? Thank you. A brief reply? No? Yes? Mr. High Representative.
In my presentation, I have already said what on the condition to have a real EU strategic power was if the American in 2024 elected a hard Republican who thinks that NATO has to be destroyed. But on the other hand, they will never do it as simple as that, because they need bases in Europe, they need Europe to be controlled, by the way. So it will not be white and black, it will not be dependency or independency of the EU. And my last point is, if we want to build a geopolitical Europe, it has to be done in bonne intelligence with the American, in good understanding with the American.
Yeah, I will come back on NATO as well. The scenario you describe is the end of NATO, simply speaking. If US decide to withdraw, NATO has been created, to tell the truth, to secure the automatic intervention of United States to help us, not to wait for the middle of the war to intervene, as it happened in the World War I and World War II, even if we are very grateful they did, because they saved us literally. But in that case, yeah, that will be the end of NATO. And if it's the end of NATO, that means the EU will have to create a mechanism to be responsible of the collective defense of the EU. And that will not be an easy process. But the thing is that if we are dependent from personalities to inflect that, that's really a risk which is very difficult. I remember I was in NATO before being UMS, and I remember the threat by Mr. Trump. It was not about to withdraw US from NATO, it was to condition the US intervention to only those who were making the effort to reach the 2% of the GDP. That was brutal. I remember also saying, well, we are not going to intervene for North Macedonia, for instance, if there is a problem. So we have to either to secure the organization through the consolidation of the organization itself, or to accept that one day it may end. And the Secretary General of NATO has put all his effort in the center of gravity of the unity of NATO, thinking that if US is putting a kind of threat of ending that, Turkey will follow, and so on. So we are not there yet. I have no clue about what will be the result of the next election, but there is a threat that this debate comes again, but I would think it will not come as brutally as it came with the Trump administration.
Muy bien. Señor Alto Representante.
Mr. High Representative, did you want to take the floor? So many interesting things have been said, but it's not important that I take the floor, but rather that everybody that decided to sign up for this course and can perhaps make the use of these experts in the matter being here. And I knew that both of them had differing viewpoints. That's why we've got them both with us this afternoon. But if I'd brought one guest per country here, we'd have 27 different viewpoints here, because the EU still doesn't have its ideas clear in many things, in defense matters. Neither. That's why we're debating it, so that everybody can understand how complex the EU is, this invention that is the EU is. And also to get people to understand what capacity to act the EU has. You can't ask the EU to do things it can't do. You can't ask it to do things that it can't do. It has the powers that it has. It has the remit that it does have. It doesn't have others. Nobody can ask. Nobody's given it powers and things. It's just pie in the sky if we think that they can do. And it's very far from reality. So putting our feet on firm ground and realizing what the EU can do, what it can't do, what it doesn't want to do, is what we mean when we say QUO VADIS EUROPA. We're looking what's the future? What does the future hold? What is the EU today and what is it going to be tomorrow? Please allow me to ask this question about the values that somebody asked, which is, what are the Union's values? The Union's values are clearly defined in the EU Treaty. An article, I don't know which number, but there's a couple of articles that explain what the values of the EU are. And I can't believe that you don't agree with them, because the way we see life, these values are unquestionable. For example, the equality of men and women, democratic respect, respect for international law. It's a whole list of all the good things that you just can't not be in agreement with. What you probably aren't in agreement with is how these values are applied and how they're defended. But per se, these values, you have to believe them. Tell me which one you don't agree with of all the EU values. So, sorry, I can't hear what the person is responding. He's not using a microphone. So it's not true that you don't agree with the values. You agree with the values, but not with the way in which these values are applied. So allow me to say two things to you. The EU's overseas policy, foreign policy, has to respond to values and interests. That's what the treaty says. We have to defend values and interests. And they say that because sometimes values and interests can be opposing. You need to look up for a balance between the two, about how you carry out your daily lives. Every day, every single human being actually has to put in the balance their values and their interests. And when there's 27 of you, and as Nicole said quite rightly, sometimes in practice it's difficult to defend your values in other countries. But let's suppose that we can. Let's suppose that all these values we believe in, we defend them because they are like our ID card. But we could still have different interests. And of course we all have different interests. Of course we do. Each country, with regard to the rest of the world, has different interests because that's life. The economic interest that Germany may have in the Chinese market isn't the same as the interest that Malta has, just to give you a pretty exaggerated example. So we have to defend values and also take into account the interests of the 27 member states. And at the same time, take into consideration our ability to act. We don't say, oh, our values haven't been well defended in Syria. Well, there was a time when a US president said, if the Syrian dictator authorizes more chemical weapons against his people, this is a red line in the sand. This is a line drawn in the sand. We can't allow that. But this declaration in Europe, some countries were enthusiastic about that declaration. France was also prepared to support American intervention in Syria. But when that red line was stepped over, when that land in the sun was stepped over, when Sadat used chemical weapons and bombed his population with chemical weapons, everybody said, oh, well, yeah. And France said, no, I'm going. And we can always say that the French planes were warming their engines on the landing strips when Obama said, no, I'm not going. Obama said, I'm not going. He thought that cost was greater than benefit, and he didn't want a war in Syria. So the Europeans who were prepared to go said, oh, if the US don't go, neither do we. But not because we don't want to, but because we can't. Because we don't have sufficient might. If the US doesn't get on board, if it doesn't meet its promise to say, oh, if you overstep this red line, I will intervene, then we can't either. And France, I think, is a little fearful of what happened, and it didn't like this. But some people said, were left really upset. What would you have done? Would you have intervened in Syria? No, you wouldn't. So with that, I've said it all. Sorry, this gentleman is still talking without using a microphone. We cannot hear in the booth if he does not use a microphone. Simple as that.
Bueno, eso es lo que hemos hecho ahora con Rusia.
This is what we've done now with Russia. This wouldn't have solved the problem. We've defended as best as we can. We Europeans are those that have most helped economically and financially, that support the Syrian exiles. We provide humanitarian aid as well. As the Admiral said, we're not a military alliance. You need to get that in your head. And I understand you've got your opinion, but the majority of Europeans have decided that we're not a military alliance. They've left the door open. They've tried to say that if one day, unanimously, the European states want a defense policy and want to become a defense alliance, they can do that. But at the moment, I can say to you that there's no enthusiasm for that idea at all. We're not a military alliance. We don't have a European army. France has used a lot this experience, the European army, l'armée européenne. They don't use that expression recently. So just be careful with words. The word never. The word never. Be careful when you use never or always. Because the nevers always arrive and the always is never last. So just be careful with these words. Never always ends before you think it's going to end, and always isn't always. I don't know if at some occasion there will be a European army, but that will create some incredible political problems. A European army requires somebody to actually head it up, and then there's political issues like, should we go to war? Who's the leader? Who decides that? This requires a level of political integration that we don't have at the moment. We've managed it with the euro, yes. Of course we can if we want to, but we don't want to. And do you know why we don't want to? Because an army is the ultimate manifestation of sovereignty, national sovereignty. You get national sovereignty if you've got a border, if you've got a currency, and if you've got an army. We've got rid of borders. We've got rid of the currency. And there is no appetite to do away with armies, just to have one army, which would be led by who and to achieve what goals. What we've done with our currency has been extraordinary, but it's taken an awful long time. And with an army, as the Admiral said quite well, we're at a stage in which we don't want to have one single army, but rather our armies in plural are able to better work together, but not merging into one single army and replacing all the others. You won't see them marching on the 14th of July in Brussels, but we could have more efficient armies. They could be better organized with a common goal, with a common outlook. And instead of having goodness knows how many different types of tanks, we could have fewer types of tanks and be more efficient. We should have a joint ability to intervene. Yes, but we don't. We don't have it. And when we say that we want to do something through this strategic compass, this invention, this rapid reaction force, that's the embryo of the ability of a joint military intervention. When the member states bring together their military capacity like an orchestra and somebody picks up the baton and directs them, then there'll be a common military force. But we're still a long, long way from that. And the example of these battle groups or battalions, and the Admiral knows about this, and on a rotation basis, each nation state is sort of out on watch and has a battalion ready to intervene when necessary. That's just never been used. Never. And there have been occasions that they should have been used. Why? Because of a lack of a political will, and also because, as the military say, and that's right when they say that, because they're serious people, it's not strength that determines the mission, it's the mission that determines strength. Can you imagine that you all of a sudden need an amphibian group, but it turns out that the battle group that's on guard is an alpine unit. They don't have amphibian qualities. That's a real problem. You can't disembark your amphibious units. Or maybe you need an intervention force to battle in the desert. But it's a company of skiers that are on guard, that are on watch. It's not the strength that determines the mission, it's the mission that determines the strength. So you can have people on standby, a force that's on standby that isn't adapted to the mission that needs to be sent on. So what we need to do is to have modular capacities so that we can mobilize strength when we need to. And even then it will be difficult. The other day I gave you the example of the airports. One of the missions that's described is to make an airport secure and to evacuate it. So far we've had the Kabul airport, the Khartoum airport, and the Dejame airport. In each case, our role has been secondary. The EU's role. In Kabul, it was inexistent. We did mobilize some planes, but not much more than that. Could we have done something more? Could we really have done anything more? If the US did what they did, because they couldn't do any more. But remember one thing, that US on their own spend in defense more than the 10 following countries on the list after them, more than the next 10 together. The US, if you look at the US in the list of military expenditure, the 10 following the US altogether spend less in defense than the US. So to give you an idea of the strength of each country in this. We've got the strength that we do have, and the US has got the strength that it does have. So, and when Khartoum had to be evacuated in Sudan, what did we do? We sent a carousel of aeroplanes from all the different countries that had aircraft, for example, Italy, France. Everyone was landing and takeoff. It would have been far more efficient to have an intervention force instead of having Italians appearing, French appearing, Spanish appearing. But we don't have that. We're hoping to get that. But the general's already explained in detail how difficult that is. And then the decision making. I think here we've got some differences with Nicole. Nicole, it's not just in security and defense where these rules have used to actually use this 2%, the 2% of the union's budget. We use unanimity to hand out the money that we put in the common fund, all 27. All 27 have to agree upon the final euro that's been spent. And that's not have to do with peace and war. 27 need to be in agreement about how our GDP should be spent. You know how difficult that is? In fact, practically the only thing that there isn't in unanimity is in trade policy. And why? Because trade policy is by a qualified majority and not unanimity, because when the union was created, trade policy wasn't very important because it was basically trade policy between different states. It was like a domestic policy, external policy in a non-globalized world that's divided into blocks, that is only just emerged from a war. Well, trade policy wasn't that important, because it's more related to the policy of building an internal market than the policy of relations with the rest of the world. And if we had to debate now whether trade policy should be taken unanimously, I think now they wouldn't accept a trade policy by qualified majority because it's too important. It's really, really important. In the 1950s and 60s, it wasn't, though. But it is now. Of course it is. Please allow Nicole, and I'm sure that you can understand me, that there's one thing that is common policy, and another thing is the policy of each state. The defense and overseas affairs policy, each state, each government has that. Each member state is sovereign in that. And nobody can prevent them from doing one thing or another. So if France decides tomorrow to intervene militarily off its own bat somewhere, nobody can say to them, no, you can't do that, because it's there. It's France's policy. Each of the 27 has its own policy. And then, in addition to that, we also want to build a common policy, but it's not going to be, it's common, not single. The euro is a common currency, but it's also a single currency. There's only a euro. And for many years, we had the EQ. You remember the EQ, anybody? That was a common currency, but it wasn't a single currency, because we had écus and pesetas, or écus and francs as well. And the Big Bang occurred when we decided that we were going to just have one currency, a single common currency. In defense, we've got common defense, but not single defense. And if France wants its own military mission, it will have its own military mission. It doesn't have to ask anybody. Our overseas defense policy wants to build agreements, as it were, to do something together, all together. And when it's a matter of doing that unanimously, I find it difficult, and I'm a person that's in a driving seat. Getting unanimity is really complicated, and we've managed to get that regarding Ukraine miraculously. And everybody said, oh, yeah, there's a war. And some people said, no, yes, I'll let you go. You go if you want to, but I don't participate. There was constructive abstention. There wasn't unanimity, but those that didn't agree allowed the others to do something. It's a way of getting unanimity to work. Even if you don't agree, just abstain. But when we're 27 plus 10, 37 or 36, the difficulties for being unanimous in anything I've always really hard to believe. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's certainly not going to be easy for us all to be in agreement on everything at the same time. So either we accept the idea of constructive abstention, or we're going to have to think differently about unanimity. We're talking about things that are really serious. It's not a matter of selling and buying. It's not trade policy. It's getting involved in a war or not. 37 countries thinking all different things. It could just lead to complete paralysis. Nobody would take a future if you've got to get 37 different countries to agree. But I do agree that we should increase these decision-making rules so as to at least reach agreements, and so that the constructive abstention is something that's used more frequently. And if somebody doesn't want to participate in something, they don't participate, but they shouldn't prevent others. Hungary pays its quota to the European Fund to finance Ukraine, but it doesn't allow planes to fly over Hungarian territory. Yeah, I pay, Hungary says, but I won't allow flights over my territory. It was a way of sort of half getting involved. So we need to find ways of providing more flexibility to our decision-making methods. Otherwise, paralysis is guaranteed. There will be no geopolitical power. It won't be a geopolitical anything. Nicole knows this. I know everybody's listening to me here. I have to be careful what I say. Just so that you know that you were very successful yesterday on Russian television. So I'm going to have to be a bit careful about my words here. It's important that we understand that when you leave unanimity to one side, you lose something. What is unanimity? It's 27 simultaneous vetoing powers. Not just to define what you want to do, but to prevent others from winning. I've found that everybody agrees in doing something, and one country says, yes, but for me to say that I agree, I need you to give me something in something else that has nothing to do with what we're debating. Now, do you want me to take part in this agreement? Well, it turns out that I've got a problem that has nothing to do with this, but either you put up with it or there's going to be no agreement. Or take it as you will, but if you want my agreement, I need you to give me this in this other thing. This has nothing to do with what we're debating now, and I know that. But if you want my agreement, you give me this or there'll be no agreement. And many occasions you end up saying, okay, whatever, here you go. This is also a reasonable way of building a political strength.
Why do we insist so much on unanimity? Because if you lose unanimity, you lose the veto power and the capacity of not, I would say, won't say blackmailing, but conditioning decisions. And I could give you examples where we've been discussing for weeks and weeks to reach agreements that are blocked by someone that say, yes, but I have this other issue, or either you solve it or there won't be an agreement. So if you value the unanimity, and you take this away, this veto power will be taken away. And not many people, or some people, don't like this. I want to have veto power because it gives me this strength, specifically this small ones. So with this, I mean that we need to support Europe, and I ask you to be European defenders, but not those that say everything that comes from Europe is okay. No, we need to be critical. Europe has its limitations, defects, and it has a past, and Nicole is right about this too. And you too, when you say, yes, but we've done things, and we continue to do so. But allow me to say that
Ayer no justifica el cólera de hoy.
the plague doesn't justify cholera, another epidemic. What we did wrong yesterday in the past doesn't yet justify that today we don't do things right so that things are not done wrong. Was the invasion illegal? Yes. It was illegal because it didn't respect international law, and we all remember Villeban in United Nations and his speech. And in any case, the U.S. intervened in Iraq, one of the worst strategic mistakes that ever made. But Europe and most of the European countries didn't participate. France didn't participate, Germany didn't participate. Spain with Aznar's government did, but stopped doing so when Zapatero came in to power. So Aznar did send soldiers, but Zapatero called the president of the U.S. and said, well, this is an illegal war, and my soldiers are leaving. And they are leaving tomorrow. And that wasn't something easy to do, I am sure, to call the most powerful man in the world and to say, well, your war is illegal. And because it's illegal, I'm leaving, and my soldiers will leave. So we also have to be aware of this. In some occasions, we were in the right side of history, and others were in the bad side of history. But nowadays, we need to be clear of what is the good and the bad side today. Not in the past, but today. And that's why we need to understand why we support Ukraine independently of our American allies doing things wrong with Iraq, something that they are clearly aware of. And I will stop here.
Hablando del estar.
Speaking of being on the good side of history, before the interpreters kill us, we don't know when he adds this, we have to conclude this session. Regarding what the High Representative was saying regarding unanimity of getting something in exchange for something, if you have the occasion, read the book just published by Javier Elorza, an excellent ambassador of Spain. That is a very fun book, and I hope that you enjoy it, where he exactly explains this, how the government of Felipe González and Minister Borrell, who was decisive with the Portuguese PEDIP, and how in the year 89 Spain made use of the unanimity so that everything that had been lost during the accession process was changed. And we vetoed or blackmailed until we achieved all of this. So I recommend the reading of this book. That is a very good and fun read. I'm not saying that things the others are doing things wrong and not myself. When I was the finance minister for Spain, the minister from another country that I won't mention said, now with you and a few more, we have a blockage minority because it's not enough with unanimity. We can also have a minority that is big enough to stop a qualified majority. But before we couldn't get this blockage, but now we can achieve it with you, and we did so. But you know what? You know what happens with this blocking minorities? And I hope I don't go against anyone, but I mean that this is a counter power for countries that don't allow the others to adopt a measure because they stop them. So what do you believe happens then? What would you do then? How? And I'm sorry, but we don't hear the other comments because the person who's speaking is not using the microphone. Well, they go against the collective blocking power. And how do you break them up? Well, you go one by one and you offer them something in exchange that is good enough for them to be able to stop being part of this group. The president of the council would call one after the other and say, what do you want to agree? And this blocking minority would get together and say, no one is going to say no at the end of the day. We will all be there together till the end. Isn't that so? So the power of blocking is lost when one of us leaves this group. And who gets the best piece of the pie? The first one to leave the minority group. So we would all say to each other that we were not going to break the agreement until someone did so. And that person would say, I couldn't say no to what they offered to me. So these are the nuances and problems of negotiations that happen with not unanimous decisions, but with qualified majorities. And this is the power, and I've gone through this, and you get used to it even. And at the end of the day, the EU, and Nicole is right about this, is very far away from being a geopolitical player. Because at the end of the day, it's a club of states that share some things, but not others. And they have decision-making processes to reach agreement that put at stake interests and values. And sometimes, yes, we say the values are there, but what about interests? Interests are something different to values. So when you're older, I am already, it is important to understand how things work. Well, thank you so much. I would like to first of all thank our wonderful speakers, as well as the High Representative for explaining things, and all of you for being here. Regarding logistics, tomorrow we have many speakers in the morning, because beyond the roundtable on China, at 11:30, we have someone that wasn't able to be here yesterday that will be connecting online. So please be here between 9:30 and 9:45. So even if the Vice President is still in the interview, we can start before 10, so that we can start a bit sooner. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Non, de rien. Mais je ne suis pas d'accord avec vous sur l'état de droit. Je vous l'expliquer.
Je t'avais demandé de commencer par l'amiral.
Honnêtement,
Que j'étais en retard.
honnêtement, je ne suis pas conscient. Désolé.